Hi everyone, I just finished listening to Tales of Ordinary Madness by Charles Bukowski on Audible. Now, I'd wanted to read something by Bukowski for quite a while because he's a towering figure in American literature, master of the short story, anti-establishment figure, poet, etc. For years I'd wanted to read his stuff, but never really got round to it. So I just got it on Audible, and I'm glad I did. Tales of Ordinary Madness is about 30 to 33, it's 34 chapters long, 32, 33 short stories. And, over the years I've been put off Bukowski because he's anachronistic. He's from a different time. This was a guy, he was an alcoholic, he was a womanizer who, just going by his language, you'd imagine now he was a misogynist, but he was very much of that kind of 1960s, 1970s era of heavy drinking, drink driving. He was a gambler. He was always at the horse races and everything. But he could write. I mean, man, he could really write. Um, the stories in there, some of the stories are crazy, but they're amazing. If you can get past the fact that Bukowski, every woman he will refer to as it's a bit early in the video for swearing, four-letter word beginning with C and ending in T, and that's his preferred word for that part of the anatomy, which features in a lot of his stories. Um, and most of the women in his stories, he, as the protagonist, because it's often written in first person, he would just say, "Oh, I'm going to rape you." And that was his fate. If you can get past that, which is pretty difficult to get past, and just see that he's part of a bygone era, but he was anti-establishment. He could really write. Um, I love some of his poetry, and often you'll be going for YouTube and you'll see it's a different take on thinking. Why do we work? Why must we work? Why can't we just live? Why? Very interesting thing to get into. But getting back to the stories, they're performed by it's audible, so they're performed by a guy who's a good performer. He's got a good voice for it. He gives a character, which may have made it easier um, to listen to than it would have been to read, because reading it might have been a bit dry on the page sometimes. But some of the lines in these guys' stories, in this guy's stories, there was one I can't remember what the story was called, but there's a line in it where he said, what the pink afternoon sun softened the pain and poverty of the Mexican town, of the town. Really good lines in there. There's he writes a lot about being in prison and what it's like being in prison and being in madhouses. He writes a lot about drinking, and you think, man, this guy's just an incorrigible alcoholic. But the fact is, and he wrote from that space, and it's an interesting perspective, and he didn't care about value judgments or anything. He was just what he was, an alcoholic who chases women, who's usually broke, despite being, a well-renowned poet and everything. Um, One of the stories he wrote towards the end of the book, there's a story called The Blanket. And it's about a man who is told in the first person again, who thinks his blanket is trying to kill him. He thinks he's going mad. He thinks the blanket is trying to kill him. He goes to see a friend who shoots the blanket because he swears the blanket is trying to kill him as well. Um, and the man who he goes to see, his wife says, "Well, you both only just saying these things because you drink." But you almost become convinced that maybe the blanket is trying to kill him. And it just kind of stays on the border of ridiculous and believable. When I go to sleep and I wake up and this thing's worked its way up around me and it's at my throat and everything, you think that's because it's a blanket. Um, but he looks at madness. There's another one where I think it's called Animal Crackers in My Soup. And he looks at, how the themes in that story, how people judge other people. So there's a woman who loves animals there. Rob thinks she's mad. Um, he's coming off of another drinking spree, wakes up in an alley, throws up, needs a drink, goes and knocks on this house. Um, and he says the house had a smell of rotting flesh and feces, but it seemed friendly. And he just paints these pictures in your mind. He was really good at it. There's another story where he ends up chopping off somebody's penis. And so you get the gist. The stories are quite out there, but they're very, very well written. Almost to the point where I think I might listen to some more of his stuff. I think there's lots of stories of him being at the races and He writes about the different kinds of people there, and he writes about the desperation of a gambler. Gambling is interesting from a psychological perspective because you always think that one big win could save me, and then a one big win happened, and it's good writer, well performed. Tales of Ordinary Madness is called. Getting back to the story, Animal Crackers in My Soup. So he ends up knocking on this door. The woman who answers it, everyone thinks she's mad because she loves animals. He's sitting there, he's sitting in a chair, and he says, despite him being drunk and a stranger and everything, there was no fear in her eyes. And he sits in his chair and he sees something circling outside, and it comes. It's an orangutan. Turns out this lady's got an orangutan and a bear and a tiger and a panther and all kinds of animals, and she calls it a liberated zoo. And all the townspeople think she's crazy, but he stays with her, and she really loves her animals. And she keeps having these dreams about the end of the world and everything. And one day, by the way, they fall in love. She becomes pregnant, so one day they go out to town, and he says, the civilized people of the town thought they were vulgar because they laughed and they shouted and they didn't act in the normal ways. But you just think it's a kind of innocent abandonment that he portrays that is quite nice. Whilst they're gone, the townsfolk have been in and killed all the animals, murdered all the animals. So they spend a couple of days burying them. And then when she's about to have a baby, they go to the hospital. And the baby is born, and it's Charles Bukowski. God knows what he was on. Alcohol. The baby is part tiger, part man, part bear, and everything. And then somebody starts dropping hydrogen bombs on San Francisco. Really good stories, really interesting stories from a really unlikable character, maybe, but maybe admirable because he makes you question, or he made me question really about which set of rules is the one that we must follow. Now, there's the idea that you shouldn't denigrate social institutions because they've survived over centuries as a way of generally promoting, furthering the greater good for the largest majority of people. So that makes sense. So in society, someone like Bukowski would have been unacceptable. And certainly if everyone lived like him, society would probably have fallen to pieces, all drunks, womanizers, gamblers, homeless people who didn't really give a damn about anything apart from getting laid. But I guess you can tell more interesting stories coming from a different perspective. He writes not about everyday life, not for most of us anyway, but about a life that exists. And one of the questions he talks about is, why is it so bad to smoke pot, although he prefers alcohol, when, if you look at the actual rules, the institutions, and this was written about the time of Vietnam, he says, where he talks about Vietnam and Israel and all the evils of society whose rules you're meant to follow, so he'd just rather have his own rules. But it got me onto Charles Bukowski, and if you can get past his, love of the word cunt and rape, and obsession with sex, and alcohol, then it's really worth reading. Anti-establishment figure, and really good writer. I think I'll go and check out some of his poetry. But the book is called Tales of Ordinary Madness, and it's well worth listening to. You might want to read it, but I listened to it on Audible. I hope you enjoy it, because I did.